that has been conducted at Iowa State. Actually, it started before I got there, but looking at the impacts of swine manure and then Aqua-Ammonia, the timing of that nitrogen application on what's coming out in our tile drainage. So the goals were, as I said, to investigate these impacts and the subsequent impacts on crop production as well. So we measured drainage water quality and the crop production, corn and soybean production. It was a corn-soybean rotation. So just to give you an idea of where we're located, this is Des Moines. This is our Gilmore City drainage facility where this research was conducted. We have 3 other drainage research facilities and probably a 4th one that will be put in here soon, where we're looking at different management practices, drainage management, land use practices on drainage water quality. We're still doing some work with liquid swine manure up at this northeast drainage facility, but the others, at least at the current time right now, do not have manure that we're studying. Okay, the way that we sample most of our drainage sites, I just wanted to give you an idea of that. We have drainage plots where we impose a treatment. There's a center tile line down that plot. We monitor the flow coming out that plot. And this is all pumped then. So we have a sump pump in there, flows out. There's an inline flow meter and also an orifice in there. So the inline flow meter, we can measure how much flow is coming out of the plot. And with that orifice, the back pressure in the pipe, we force a small portion of all the water into a sample container. So it's a flow proportional water sampler. It works fairly well as long as you have electricity. We had one site where we had flooding conditions in 2010 and blew all the GFIs, and so then the pumps didn't work, but other than that, works fairly well. The plots there at Gilmore City were 50-foot wide, 125-foot long. We do have border tiles to try to isolate flow from one plot to the next. And this is looking down in one of our sumps. There's actually 3 plots that come into an individualized sump. Here's the flow meters. There's where the orifice is, and there's the sample bottles where the water would collect. We will go out at least weekly to take representative samples from what's collected in the bottles and read the flow meters. Some of our newer sites where we have data logging capabilities on the flow meters so we can get shorter interval measures of drainage flow. So the treatments that we had that I'll talk about today, 7 treatments. Looking at fall Aqua-Ammonia application and spring Aqua-Ammonia. The fall application was in late October to mid-November when soils were 50 degrees and cooling. Then we had a fall liquid swine manure and a spring liquid swine manure. The application, the total nitrogen application rate of those was 218 kilograms of N per hectare. The fall ammonia was 168. Then one of the treatments that we had in there as well, and this is, some may have heard some information about this. In Iowa, it was, well, it's still allowed to a certain extent, but producers at the time of this study could put on liquid swine manure to ground going to soybeans at a nitrogen rate equivalent to crop removal or the soybean removal of nitrogen. And so there was nobody knows exactly how many manure plants had it in there, but there was some that where manure would go on every year in a corn-soybean rotation. And so this study looked at that where it was 168 kilograms of N per hectare applied before corn and before beans. And then there was also a fall ammonia and spring ammonia at a higher rate, 252. When this study started, the recommendations for nitrogen availability for the liquid swine manure was 75. So that's why the total nitrogen application rate here was higher than our Aqua-Ammonia. But this is the actual total N application that went down with that liquid swine manure. Okay, just to give a little bit of background on what we saw there, kind of for timing of precipitation. First total amount during the drainage season, March to November, the long-term 30-year average in the area is about 753 millimeters. So we were slightly below that in almost all years. So slightly drier than normal. One of the other things, if we start thinking about fall application of fertilizer and manure, what's the fall rainfall? And in general, we're probably, some of these years a little below, or quite a bit below, and some years maybe more than the average rainfall. But one of the things in Iowa, if we look at it, is that most of our rain comes, say, April through August, and then not as much in the fall of the year. And we'll see that reflected in the drainage. That's different through different parts of the Corn Belt. Further east in the Corn Belt, they may get a lot more winter drainage. We hardly get any in Iowa because of the frozen soils, which I think impacts the results that we see from the timing of nitrogen application. So if we look at the drainage, and this is similar to the kind of 20-plus year average that we see at this site, we have about 69% of our annual drainage occurring in May and June. So just in those 2 months, whereas we see, as we start to get to September, October, November, very little subsurface drainage in these systems, and then we'll usually get froze up by the time November, December, January comes along. Okay, so what did our nitrate concentrations look like? This is a plot of monthly nitrate concentrations for those 4 years. And what we see, this is the Aqua-Ammonia at 168, Aqua-Ammonia 252, and then the fall and spring manure. What we see is only a couple months where we see a statistically significant difference between the fall and the spring application, and actually in some of these cases it's higher with the spring application. So at this site we saw very little difference, really no difference between the fall and the spring application of either liquid swine manure or commercial fertilizer. Okay, where we did see a difference, probably the main difference we saw in this was that we see higher nitrate concentrations where we have that manure applied every year in a corn-soybean system. Not surprising, because we're putting on more nitrogen in a 2-year cycle than we are for just putting it on before the corn crop. But there was some thinking, well, if the soybean removes that nitrogen from the system, we can, I guess, shut off any fixation that it has. But we see nitrate coming out at higher concentrations when we apply that manure every year in the corn-soybean system. Okay, so if we look at the flow-weighted annual nitrate concentrations, you can see here's our 4-year average, no difference between the fall and the spring application. As I said, I think part of this is where we're at. We don't see a lot of that winter drainage in our area, and so this is surprisingly, there's not a lot of water quality data out there on fall application versus spring application, at least in our region. Giles Randall has some work in Minnesota. We have this work. There's some work in Illinois, but I think this is still an area of some need. So again, we saw really no difference there. In fact, we saw at that higher nitrogen application rate, this is still somewhat surprising to us, we saw higher concentration coming out when we had that spring application of Aqua-Ammonia. And then we saw some of the similar trend, although not statistically significant, when we look at the fall versus spring manure. But we do see when we had that fall manure every year, we had higher nitrate concentrations than where we applied the manure just before the corn there. So quite a bit higher. I think it was about a 35% increase at least. Okay, nitrate loss. I show this just to show, on average, during these years, we lost between about 40 and 50 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. Because of the plot variability in flow, it's tough to get a good, to see much statistical difference in nitrogen loss. We see it in concentration, but it's more difficult in nitrogen loss. others that have done this type of work have seen similar results. Okay, for a farmer, what do they want to know is perhaps what happens to my corn yield. And so when we start looking at the fall versus spring, at the 168, on average we saw no difference in corn yield. We saw, when we look at the fall versus spring, at the higher rate, we do see better corn yield with the spring application than the fall. But the biggest thing here is that for both of those manure treatments, fall or spring, we see higher corn yield than if we had the Aqua-Ammonia. At either rates, even though the total nitrogen application rate here was 218 versus 252, we still see a statistically significant increase in corn yield, which I'd say is a benefit for those crop producers that are looking at using manure as their nitrogen resource. Soybean yield, really not much difference, although one of the things we did see was that the soybean yields where the nitrogen had been applied in the spring to the previous corn crop, we saw higher soybean yields. So we did here, if we look at that fall versus spring 168, we see it fall versus spring at 252, and even this fall versus spring at 218. So, but one of the things I guess that to think about in our study, and we saw virtually no difference due to the timing of nitrogen application. And so I think that still one of the biggest factors, if we're looking at nitrate-nitrogen concentrations in our drainage water, is the nitrogen application rate, at least in our conditions. And so this was actually some information we generated from the 15-plus years of research at this site, a relationship between nitrate concentration and the N application rate to corn in a corn bean rotation, and this is that relationship. Then we also compared that relationship to other data at different scales in Iowa or Minnesota, where the data was available. So some work by Dr. Dan James and others, Dr. Giles Randall, and you can see it all kind of follows along that same trend. So as we start working with some producers on this, if we have producers in a corn-soybean rotation that may be up at 200, and we can get them to reduce their application rate down to maybe the maximum return to nitrogen level, which is about 130 to 140 in Iowa, we might be able to make big gains in reducing nitrate loss through the drainage systems. But if we have producers that are down at 150 and we reduce application rate by 20 pounds, the change in nitrate concentration is not great. Okay, so for the work that we've done here through this 4 years, the fall or spring application resulted in similar nitrate concentrations in that subsurface drainage. The manure applications every year, we did see increased nitrate concentrations better than if it was just applied prior to the corn crop. I think one of the biggest things too is that we saw similar nitrate concentrations between liquid swine manure and ammonia. So, in Iowa, in certainly other states, there's a lot of discussion about the negative environmental impacts of manure. But from a nitrate perspective, if we're putting similar nitrogen application rates on of liquid swine manure or commercial fertilizer, we're seeing similar nitrate loss in that drainage water. We saw better corn yields with the liquid swine manure, and I just want to highlight that from our research, really that nitrogen application rate to corn is probably the most critical factor in looking at that drainage water quality, at least from a nitrate perspective. Okay, you can find more information about this study in the Transactions of ASABE paper. I want to note that funding for this project is provided by the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship through the Ag Management Fund. That's actually fees that are collected on the sale of ag fertilizer and ag chemicals in the state, help support this type of research. So. The increased yield? No, I I don't have an explanation, but I mean, some people, I think, see that improved yield with, with manure compared to commercial fertilizer, but I don't have yes, that 218 was total, and so even though it was, you might expect that compared to the 168 treatment, but it was surprising that even that 252 Aqua-Ammonia treatment didn't have the same yields. That probably, it may have, impacted it. There was soil test P and K measurements through there, and it was not low. The soils were not testing low in that, at least. Charles. Yes. Yep. It is not a common practice. Most farmers, if they were putting it on in the fall, it would be anhydrous ammonia. It was done in part because of the accuracy of application was why Aqua-Ammonia was used versus anhydrous ammonia. So I think that's a good question about that. That was what was done during that time period. This was okay. Method of manure application is injection, and actually in the paper you can see the picture of, I should have put it on here, a picture of the applicator or a diagram of that schematic of the applicator. This was a conventional tillage system. So there was fall tillage and spring tillage in this one. This site we now have conventional tillage versus no-till, but at that time it was more of a conventional tillage system.